Hypnosis has a long and controversial history, from its links to the occult and mind control, and its portrayal in fiction, often involving an evil hypnotist, through to its ability to be used to reduce pain, to give people greater control over their bodily functions, and increase the effectiveness of therapies to overcome emotional and psychological problems. In this series, we will cover the story of hypnosis, from its ancient past through to mesmerism in the 1700s, on to the creation of hypnotism in the mid-1800s, into the early research era, and on to hypnosis in the present day. We will end the series exploring the dark side of hypnosis and how hypnosis has been portrayed in fiction. In this episode, we'll be exploring the birth of hypnotism from James Braid, the spread of hypnosis through Europe in the late 1800s, and into the scientific study of hypnosis through the 20th century. Hypnosis is the fixation of attention on a single idea, stimuli, or object. James Braid, who coined the term hypnotism, although that and similar terms had been used in different contexts since about the 1620s, tried to move on to the term monoideism because of this fixation of attention, but that never caught on. The psychiatrist Milton Erickson frequently referred to hypnosis as monoideism in his lectures rather than hypnosis, and said that all hypnosis is a loss of the multiplicity of the foci of attention, and went on to say that hypnosis is an altered state of consciousness in the same sense as you experience in everyday life when you're reading a book and your wife speaks to you and you make no immediate response. You are obviously experiencing some sort of altered state involving time distortion when 10 minutes later you answer, "Did you speak to me?" Erickson seems to have thought of hypnosis as an altered state, but not in the sense of having a specific brainwave pattern that could be detected, but instead in the sense that the person isn't attending to their surroundings in a normal, everyday, waking way. They are in a state of absorption around an idea, stimuli, or object. This focused attention and the other traits that go with this, like enhanced control over bodily processes and reduced self-consciousness, would obviously have a neurological pattern, because everything you do from moment to moment has a pattern of activity, and experiencing the world in this way would be no different. When someone is hypnotized, there is a presence of these traits in the way the brain is functioning, with decreased activity in the default mode network and greater functional connectivity between the executive control network and the salience network. What people describe as hypnosis has two key traits: automaticity and responses feeling very real to the hypnotized subject. Automaticity is where responses that occur feel to the subject that they occurred without their conscious involvement, like swatting a fly away from your face without thinking about it and feeling like it happened automatically. The other key trait, responding to suggestions or ideas with the response feeling very real to the subject, would have, for example, a subject being told that they can't stand up, and if they accept this idea, then the idea that they can't stand up will feel very real to them, no matter how much they want to stand up and try to stand. They won't be able to do so. They may be thinking that they don't believe that this is going to work. They don't believe they're hypnotized, and they believe that they'll be able to stand. But this doesn't change the perceived reality of the situation that they found themselves in. A common perspective is that hypnosis is about increasing suggestibility, so that people do as you tell them. This is a very common myth. Hypnotizing someone doesn't increase their suggestibility. The very slight increase in suggestibility in some people is thought to be due to other everyday ordinary factors. For example, it is common for people to be slightly more suggestible to authority figures like visiting doctors, or your employer when you're in work, or your therapist during therapy. Some people respond to experts in their fields or people they look up to by responding more to suggestions given by those people. That's why you get celebrity endorsements. If people look up to the celebrity, then they're more likely to buy the products the celebrity suggests, either explicitly or implicitly, are good. People are also more likely to respond to suggestions when they're motivated to do so. None of this is due to hypnosis, though. What a hypnotist is looking for when doing hypnosis isn't an increase in suggestibility, it's an increase in responsiveness to presented ideas. That is, clients are responding automatically to the ideas presented. They aren't more suggestible, but they are more responsive to communication. Some people, when hypnotized, increase suggestibility a little, others stay the same. They don't become more suggestible or less suggestible, and some become less suggestible when hypnotized. This discussion about whether hypnosis is a special state or a process, and whether it was about increased suggestibility where people could assert their will over others, or an increase in responsiveness where people had greater control over themselves and their own abilities, was prevalent during the latter half of the 20th century. But it didn't start there. It was on the minds of those researching hypnosis right from the beginning. In November 1841, British surgeon James Braid attended a demonstration by mesmerist Charles Lafontaine. At the time, Braid believed that mesmerism was fake, that it was just stooges colluding with the mesmerist to give a performance. Braid left the show feeling that what he had seen had reinforced his views that what he witnessed was fake. A week later, Braid attended another demonstration by Lafontaine. This time, he saw something which stood out. Lafontaine told a subject that they couldn't open their eyes, and sure enough, this is what occurred. Braid felt that this one thing, at least, seemed to have been genuine. It caught his attention. He wanted to know what the physiological cause of this was. Braid attended a demonstration again the next night and watched with great interest when the subject was told that they couldn't open their eyes. Braid was sure he had worked out the cause of this, but didn't want to say anything until he had had a chance to test his theory through experiments and observations. During Braid's experiments, he noticed that he too could elicit eyelid catalepsy, and that subjects were unresponsive to painful stimuli. Braid attended further demonstrations by Lafontaine to observe his method and find a rational explanation for those observations. Braid concluded that neurohypnotism, as he termed it, was caused by nervous fatigue from holding focused attention, and once the subject is experiencing this nervous fatigue, they become more responsive to their imagination, and so through expectation and influence can create a perspective of reality for themselves from the ideas they're responding to. He felt that hand passes, fixing a subject's gaze, or having subjects holding or touching a magnetized object were just ways of focusing attention, inducing nervous fatigue, and using the subject's expectations and imagination to achieve the displayed results. Not a result of animal magnetism or any kind of magnetic fluid, and not requiring close contact with subjects, as had often been employed by mesmerists with stroking, touching, close hand passes, and sitting almost touching clients. This close contact of the mesmerist, and the fact that many subjects were female and many mesmerists were male, concerned people and gave mesmerism an unsavoury feel. With Braid's approach, it was about what was being said and what the subject was being encouraged to do, so the practitioner could sit some distance from the client while guiding them into hypnosis. Initially, Braid's main way of inducing hypnosis was through focusing attention with an object like a candle. But as he worked with more clients and developed his theories, he realized he could induce hypnosis through suggestion alone, without needing additional aids. Braid developed the term neurohypnology, later shortened to neurohypnology, which was the study of nervous sleep, using this term as a way of trying to say that this state isn't sleep, but is sleep-like and conscious at the same time. Neurohypnotism was shortened to hypnotism, which is what we know it as today. As Braid continued to research and experiment, his thoughts progressed and he changed hypnotism to monoideism, emphasizing the narrowed focus of attention found as people entered hypnosis, rather than it being about fatigue of the nervous system, feeling that this was the most important aspect of hypnosis, because people became occupied by a single idea to the exclusion of all other ideas. But this term never really caught on. Milton Erickson often used this term, and it can still be found being used in some medical settings, but it isn't a term that most of the general public would know. This may well be the first example of the state versus non-state question which largely dominated the hypnosis field through the 1900s, with Braid initially focusing on hypnosis as related to the physiological state of nervous fatigue, and through experiments and observations progressing to the non-state perspective of it being about what the subject was doing. Through the second half of the 1800s, hypnotism started to be used in place of mesmerism in stage shows, literature and occult practices, which was unfortunate because it meant hypnotism has continued to struggle to escape its mesmeric roots and lacked credibility, with stage hypnotists springing up, holding shows with bold claims and fanciful posters, like having multiple men standing on top of a person stretched like a plank of wood between two chairs, while commanding that they can make people do their bidding. Hypnosis was often talked about as inducing trance, and trance was often talked about as a thing that mediums enter to do their mediumship, that healers enter to do their healing. Trance was linked to fortune-telling, to communicating with the dead, to dowsing and various other paranormal activities, with the perspective of trance as being some kind of distinct altered state. So hypnosis shot straight into an identity problem, and any legitimate medical professional studying hypnosis ran the risk of being shunned and having their medical license revoked. In the 1860s, Ambroise Auguste Lebault started exploring hypnosis based on the work of James Braid. Lebault's view was that hypnosis was a form of sleep created through suggestion, and that hypnosis worked especially well with nervous complaints. He would place his hand on a client's forehead and authoritatively command, "You're going to sleep." He would have the client close their eyes while telling them that they are sleeping. At this point, he would lift up one of the client's arms and tell them that they can't put it down. He would tell them to start rotating their arms and that they can't stop the rotating. While saying this, he himself would be rotating his arms. Then he would give the client direct suggestions that their symptoms were cured, and in most cases, clients' problems would go away. He felt hypnosis was something the hypnotist did to a client, rather than something a client did for themselves. Lebault tried to raise awareness of hypnosis and his findings, including releasing a book in 1866, which allegedly only sold 5 copies in its first 5 years. It wasn't until he encountered Hippolyte Bernheim in 1882 that he finally managed to raise awareness of hypnosis. Bernheim was sceptical about hypnosis and so sent Lebault a patient to try and treat, who he had been unsuccessful with. He thought that this would prove Lebault was a fraud. As it turned out, Lebault treated the patient successfully, and the two men became friends. Bernheim and Lebault set up the Nancy School of Hypnotism. Bernheim saw suggestion as the key element to hypnosis. He felt that all hypnotic phenomena which was described as evidence that someone was hypnotized, was actually just evidence of the subject following the suggestions of the hypnotist to develop those phenomena. He said that all hypnotic phenomena happen in everyday wakefulness, but through focusing attention on suggestions, you can enhance the experience of the phenomena being elicited. Unlike Lebault, Bernheim didn't think about subjects as being like automatons under the spell of the hypnotist. He was direct and forcible in his approach, but felt that the work of the subject resided within the subject. If they didn't follow along and engage in the process or suggestions, then they didn't respond to the process or suggestions. Bernheim's approach is recognisably more similar to what modern-day authoritarian hypnotists would do today. Look at me and begin to think of nothing but sleep. Your eyelids begin to feel heavy. Your eyes are tired. They begin to blink. They're moist. You can't see distinctly. Your eyes are closing. Your eyelids are closing. You can't keep them open any longer. Your arms feel heavy, so do your legs. You can't feel anything. Your hands remain motionless. You see nothing. You're going to sleep. Going to sleep. Sleep. At this point, those clients who are engaging with the process and following along to the suggestions close their eyes, relax their body, remain motionless, and having followed the suggestions to this point, increase in responsiveness to subsequent suggestions. Bernheim would then continue with giving suggestions that the client will no longer have their problem, and positive suggestions for general health and well-being. The approach taken by Lebault and Bernheim in the early days was probably the start of suggestion therapy, which has clouded perception among the public of hypnotherapy ever since, and unfortunately, since then, many hypnosis training schools set up teaching people with no requirement of clinical knowledge or experience how to do suggestion-only hypnosis and therapy, where the students are trained to recite a scripted induction and suggestions to no longer have the problem, followed by suggestions for continued health, well-being, and perhaps improved belief in themselves, rather than being taught evidence-informed psychotherapy and requiring clinical experience to treat patients. This issue has divided opinion among hypnotists for the last 100 or so years, with some schools only teaching professional clinicians, believing non-clinicians shouldn't be allowed to learn hypnosis to use therapeutically with others, and other schools teaching anyone who'll pay, and then there are those trying to find a balance between these two perspectives. It's common for the public to think that this is what hypnotherapy is, that it's about people closing their eyes, being hypnotized, and then having their problem suggested away, which can lead to clients visiting hypnotherapists with unrealistic expectations and inaccurate views of what to expect from the therapeutic process. Only inexperienced or poorly trained hypnotherapists nowadays would practice suggestion therapy as their form of therapy. Experienced and well-trained hypnotherapists would be using hypnosis in conjunction with evidence-informed psychological and psychotherapeutic knowledge and approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy. As Bernheim developed his ideas, he moved from just suggesting problems away and giving positive suggestions for health and well-being to encouraging people to mentally rehearse and then go out and practice alternative behaviours which would help them overcome their problem, moving away from the idea of just suggesting problems away to working at addressing and resolving the problem itself. Although nowadays therapists would see this as an early precursor to modern psychotherapy based on the research and evidence gained over more than a century since Bernheim's work, this approach seemed shallow to some at the time. It seemed too much like a quick fix. There was no deep analysis of trying to uncover or identify a past-based root cause of the problem. The focus of therapy was on resolving the problem as it currently presented and look at how changes could be maintained into the future. Over time, Lebault and Bernheim fell out. Lebault clung to his theory of hypnosis being a special state of sleep and distanced himself from Bernheim, who maintained that it was just people engaging with suggestions. At a London conference in 1892, Bernheim famously stood up and stated that there is no hypnotism, there is only suggestion. He wasn't stating that hypnosis wasn't real, but rather stating that it is just the product of natural everyday processes and abilities, and that what people describe as hypnotism is just the product of the suggestions given and engagement of the client with those suggestions. In part 2, we'll look at the work of Jean-Martin Charcot, Pierre Janet, and the loss of interest in hypnosis as the 19th century drew to a close, and then the rise of self-hypnosis at the start of the 20th century. At about the same time that Lebault and Bernheim were working together in the Nancy School, Jean-Martin Charcot was developing different ideas about hypnosis. Charcot saw hypnosis as a form of hysteria and linked to illness, whereas Bernheim saw hypnosis as something linked to health and well-being. This difference created conflict between the two hypnosis schools. Charcot would get hysteria symptoms occurring in hypnotized patients and used this as evidence that hypnosis was a form of hysteria, whereas Bernheim's view was that this was actually due to the suggestions Charcot was giving to those he was hypnotizing. Ultimately, having someone with Charcot's standing interested in the study of hypnosis added credibility back to the field again, although it didn't increase popularity for hypnosis. Charcot believed that hypnosis was made up of a series of nervous states, each with their own characteristics. There was the cataleptic state, which involved patients demonstrating catalepsy, where limbs could be moved and they would remain in the position they were placed. There was a reduction of reflex responses. Breathing was slow, often with pauses between breaths, and automatic behaviours could be elicited. There was the lethargic state, which was characterised by loose and limp muscles, deep, rapid breathing, and neuromuscular hyperexcitability, where muscles respond strongly to stimulation. The third state was the somnambulistic state, where reflexes and muscular responses were normal and the subject could easily follow complex suggestions. Charcot would induce these states with different induction techniques. To induce catalepsy, he would have his subjects focus on a bright light or would use a sudden loud noise. For lethargy, he would have subjects fix their gaze on something for a prolonged period of time, or would have them close their eyes and then would apply pressure to their eyelids. For somnambulism, he would guide the subject into a cataleptic or lethargic state and would continue with fixing attention and rubbing the subject's head. A student of Charcot's, Pierre Janet, took a different view of hypnosis, which became popular through the 1900s with some modern hypnosis researchers, which was that hypnosis was a form of dissociation. Janet also linked the idea that current problems may have their roots in the client's past and that people have a subconscious where there are thoughts and ideas on a level lower than consciousness, and that when someone can't recall a memory, it's because they're dissociated from the memory, and by helping them to associate with the memory, they'll be able to recall it again. Some of these ideas went on to influence the continued progress of psychotherapy and hypnotherapy through the 1900s. As a new century approached, focus on hypnosis waned, with Bernheim's theories being more accepted than Charcot's, and Charcot's standing in the medical world being impacted by this. A large portion of the medical and scientific community turned their backs on Bernheim. Those who believed in Charcot's theories had their convictions overturned, and with Bernheim's suggestive therapeutics, as it was termed, being thought of as simplistic, the medical establishment largely stopped focusing on hypnosis. One of Bernheim's students, Sigmund Freud, had successes with hypnosis. Freud had visited France and met with Charcot before returning sometime later to train with Lebault and Bernheim. He also liked Pierre Janet's ideas about the subconscious. Freud developed a reputation for himself, initially using hypnosis in his treatments, but then one day he had an experience which made him turn his back on hypnosis. Freud described that he had a patient who was responding incredibly well to hypnosis. She was making great progress. Then one session, he had helped her relieve suffering and pain, and she jumped up and threw her arms around him. He felt from that point on, hypnosis shouldn't be used. He concluded that he had grasped the mysterious element that was at work behind hypnosis, and in order to exclude or at least isolate that, it was necessary to abandon the use of hypnosis completely. From this, he developed the idea of transference. He felt that the woman didn't react like that because of his own irresistible personal attraction, so this response must have been because the woman suddenly saw Freud as a fantasy figure from her past with whom this reaction would have been acceptable, rather than perhaps seeing the woman's behaviour as excitement or an emotional response to the success of treatment. Freud moved away from hypnosis, and this moving away further reduced interest in the subject and unfortunately separated it from the field of psychology and psychotherapy, as those in these fields turned their backs on it, something which still impacts these areas today, as Freud's theories and approach to psychotherapy became more popular. Pierre Janet described it as it wasn't that hypnotism had been repudiated or the power of suggestion denied, it was simply that people had ceased to talk about them. As the 1800s drew to a close, the ideas of Lebault and Bernheim were the more accepted view of hypnosis. This led to a rise in hypnotic practitioners recommending and promoting the idea of self-hypnosis. Mesmerism was largely something done to a subject, where importance was placed on mesmerism, requiring an operator to channel the magnetic fluid or animal magnetism into the subject. Whereas people like James Braid, recognizing that hypnosis can be induced by focusing attention without needing complex rituals or added props, and was a method which anyone could do for themselves. You don't need someone to help you focus your attention on something. You can do that yourself. Braid recognized that many meditation practices from the East were of people guiding themselves into the meditation through their focused attention, and that you can do the same with hypnosis. With his view being that hypnosis was something subjects engaged in and did for themselves, with the hypnotist just being a guide, he would teach subjects how to guide themselves into hypnosis, essentially teaching them self-hypnosis. He also gave examples of his personal use of self-hypnosis for things like pain control. Apart from a few mentions in books and articles about hypnosis, the idea of self-hypnosis didn't really take off as a standalone subject until the early 1900s with the work of Émile Coué. In 1885, Émile Coué met and studied with Lebault. In 1910, with 25 years of experience, Coué set up his own school teaching his methods. Since Braid, there had been the idea of waking hypnosis or waking suggestions, the idea that you can give the suggestions that you would give to someone who is hypnotized, and without them being formally hypnotized, they can engage in and respond to those ideas to varying degrees of success. Coué dropped the idea of trance entirely and focused on waking suggestion and the idea that all suggestion, in reality, is just auto-suggestion. Or, as you'll frequently hear hypnotists claim, all hypnosis is self-hypnosis. To a person experiencing pain, Coué stated, Every time you have pain, physical or otherwise, you'll go quietly to your room, sit down and shut your eyes. Pass your hand lightly across your forehead if it is a mental distress, or upon the part that hurts if it is pain in any part of the body, and repeat the words, "It is going, very rapidly, even at the risk of gabbling. The essential idea is to say, "It is going, so quickly that it is impossible for a thought of contrary nature to force itself between the words. We thus actually think it is going, and as all ideas we fix upon the mind become a reality to us, the pain, physical or mental, vanishes. And should the pain return, repeat the process 10, 20, 50, 100, 200 times if necessary. For it is better to pass the entire day saying it is going, than to suffer pain and complain about it." Following Coué's work and promotion of the idea of autosuggestion, further works teaching self-hypnosis appeared, and by the 1950s, interest in self-hypnosis increased among the public, with books and mail-order home study courses on self-hypnosis becoming popular, which continued through much of the remainder of the 20th century. Within the scientific community, during the early part of the 20th century, there was a lull in focus on researching hypnosis, especially in Europe and the UK, where there had been a lot of focus through the mid to late 1800s. One of the key people during this period who was carrying out research was psychologist Clark Hull. Hull worked at trying to bring scientific rigour to the field of hypnosis and started to focus on observable behaviours of hypnotised subjects rather than perhaps what subjects would self-report. He wanted to make the study of hypnosis systemised, controlled and repeatable, so introduced using a hypnosis script and having this audio recorded so that every subject was hypnotised in exactly the same way and they wouldn't be influenced by any biases of the operator or variations in approach between subjects. This began the modern studies of hypnosis. In scientific research, you want to be able to measure what is happening. So if the induction is done by a practitioner face-to-face with a subject, they may not say it exactly the same each time to each client, even if they think they are. And it may be these subtle nuances which have led to the effect the study is measuring. So to eliminate this, the induction can be audio recorded, then everyone gets the same approach. What you're really measuring when doing this isn't whether hypnosis itself works for one problem or another, or what percentage of people can be hypnotized, or what hypnotic phenomena different people can do within hypnosis. It is what percentage of people respond to that one induction or way of being hypnotized, and how different people respond to that specific induction. This was something one of Clark Hull's students, Milton Erickson, observed. He was in lectures held by Hull in 1923 and was interested in learning more about hypnosis. He found that he could hypnotize subjects Hull had said were unhypnotizable if he varied the induction. One difference between clinical working and research is that for research you need to be able to have something measurable and replicable. If the induction is changed to suit each subject, then you aren't measuring or replicating the same thing, you are doing something different each time. The World Wars stimulated a slight revival of interest in hypnosis as a treatment for war neuroses. There were many therapists like Dr. Max Noon who used hypnosis in their treatments. Noon treated over 1,600 patients with the use of hypnosis and was given the reputation of magical healer. Noon stated that not everyone can be cured. Some people take hours to treat and others can be cured in a split second. Through much of the 20th century, Milton Erickson was a controversial but highly respected practitioner within the field of hypnosis and psychological therapy. Erickson believed that most people could be hypnotized if the induction was tailored to them as an individual. He had an experience early in his research where someone pretended to be hypnotized. He believed they were hypnotized until they explained how they did what they did. He also had people who would respond to suggestions to do things which normally people can't do, like having the pupil of one eye narrow while the pupil of the other eye dilates, and found that some people could do this consciously. This led Erickson to question how you can know whether you have got a hypnotic response or not. He wanted to know how to recognize if someone is responding because of hypnosis or because they were told to do something, and so they did it. Erickson concluded that the best way to do hypnotic research was to use indirect techniques so that subjects wouldn't know what they were expected to do, and so they couldn't follow along to something that they haven't been told. Erickson contributed a wealth of ideas to the field of hypnotherapy. He contributed the use of confusion, indirect language patterns, the idea that we have greater skills and abilities than we realise, and what he said was his main contribution to therapy, the utilization principle. Erickson wasn't the first to develop these ideas. Some he discovered himself, but others had also discovered these things, like using indirect techniques and tailoring the approach to the subject, which were discussed prior to Erickson by Boris Sidus in 1898 and Albert Moll in 1890. Despite Erickson's impact on the field of hypnotherapy, there are still hypnotherapists who have never heard of him or his approach, or who only know him as a name that they've heard somewhere. There is another hypnotherapist who had a big impact on the hypnotherapy community, and that was Dave Ellman. Ellman was a radio host and variety performer. Ellman learned hypnosis early in his life to help his father with pain management. He also performed as the world's youngest and fastest hypnotist. In 1949, following his time as a radio host, he decided to start teaching hypnosis to doctors and dentists. His approach to hypnotizing people was fast and effective, and his Ellman induction is still performed by many hypnotists today. As the hypnotherapy field has grown and acceptance among the scientific community has increased, there has been a smoothing out of standout characters or contributors. Through the 1950s to 1960s, Milton Erickson and Dave Ellman stood out in the crowd. They both taught hypnosis to medical professionals. They were both confident, commanding people, and both attracted followers of their approach to hypnosis. There were many more significant contributors at the time, but they never stood out with unique ideas like these two. From the 1970s, there hasn't really been many standout individuals with radical ideas, approaches, or contributions to expand the field, like many other scientific areas of study. There have been many researchers who have helped to incrementally advance knowledge and understanding within the field and helped to build general consensus around a current best explanation and understanding of what hypnosis is and how it works. From the 1970s, Richard Bandler and John Grinder studied Milton Erickson's approach as they developed neurolinguistic programming, NLP. Erickson's name became associated with the NLP community. He would be referenced on NLP training courses and in NLP books, whereas the lay hypnotherapy courses that non-clinicians could attend to train to become hypnotherapists, would frequently not include reference to Erickson. Among researchers, Erickson remained respected and regarded as a clinician and had been well regarded as an educator of hypnosis for his lectures during the 50s and 60s. Researchers carried out research on ideas of Erickson's, like the idea of using indirect suggestion, and found that hypnosis works just fine whether you do it directly or indirectly. One isn't superior over the other. Similar to the early days of the hypnosis and mesmerism debate, where researchers would find that you can get results using hand passes, stroking, and objects, or having someone gaze at the hypnotist's fingers or a spot on the wall, but you can also get results just by talking to the subject directly and asking them to focus their attention. Before the mid-1900s, hypnosis was largely following two paths. There were those who used hypnosis for entertainment or spiritualistic practices, and those who used hypnosis therapeutically. Those who used hypnosis therapeutically were largely the same people trying to research what hypnosis was and what they thought was going on. Many of the popular books around the first half of the 20th century about hypnosis were written by stage hypnotists and lay hypnotists rather than medical professionals. In the mid-20th century, therapeutic hypnosis took three paths. The stage hypnotists continued, and due to uncertainty about the risks involved in the use of hypnosis for entertainment, many countries started investigating this, and in some places banned the use of hypnosis. As many educational and medical institutions also banned hypnosis, others introduced laws, and hypnosis societies started to appear. Among those interested in therapeutic hypnosis, there seemed to begin a growing divide between those researching hypnosis and those using hypnosis in their clinical practice. And among clinicians, there seemed to be a divide into those who were interested in the work of Milton Erickson due to his extensive articles, books and medical lectures, and those interested in the approach of Dave Ellman based on his book Hypnotherapy, which was originally released self-published as Findings in Hypnosis in 1964, and his lectures and demonstrations. Although Ellman taught medical professionals, his approach has become popular among lay hypnotists and is often the basis of many lay hypnosis courses, possibly because it seems much easier to do than Ericksonian hypnosis, which can seem overwhelming with its talk of language patterns, not using scripts and tailoring treatments rather than focusing on suggestion therapy. In part 3, we'll look at how hypnosis research has progressed to try to gain an understanding of what hypnosis is and how it works. Since the days of mesmerism, there's always been a desire and attempt to develop a theory which can explain what hypnosis is and how it works. James Braid progressed in his own research from seeing hypnosis as a state of nervous sleep to a process of focused attention. Libault considered it a special state of sleep. Bernheim thought of hypnosis as a process of active engagement with suggestions, and Charcot believed that hypnosis was made up of a series of nervous states. Moving into the 20th century, researchers started to explore this question of what hypnosis is and how it works through greatly improved scientific experiments. There are two parts to hypnosis, the doing and the experiencing. People say, I'm doing hypnosis, I'm hypnotizing you, and they say, I'm in hypnosis, I'm hypnotized. Doing hypnosis is just the term given to communication skills used to communicate ideas that focus and absorb non-conscious attention. The classic hypnotic therapeutic trance, a trance in this context, is a state of focused absorption that manifests with cognitive, behavioural and biological traits. It isn't like a drug-induced altered state, but rather like the difference between being anxious or being relaxed. Both of these will have various differences, including different brainwave patterns. They'll have different cognitive thinking styles, different behaviours associated with them, different beliefs being held while in one state or the other, and a different composition of hormones flowing through the body. Is where a person has entered a state of heightened neuroplasticity, where they're able to learn new information, updating old patterns, or have greater control over themselves, like over unconscious processes. Hypnotic techniques can be used to induce relaxation, anger, confusion, fear, pain, love, sadness, desire, or any other trance state. The question in hypnosis research through much of the latter half of the 1900s was on the idea of whether hypnosis was a special trance state, that is a measurable state of mind you could call a hypnotic state, or whether it is in fact just people complying either knowingly or unknowingly and acting out the role of the hypnotic subject and trying to understand what aspects of hypnosis are essential and which are products of suggestion. Most modern researchers accept a socio-cognitive model of hypnosis rather than a special state theory, but researchers weren't always in such close agreement. Milton Erickson was curious about whether a subject is acting as if they were hypnotized, or if they actually were hypnotized, concluding, "My feeling that in hypnotic research one should resort to indirect method as much as possible to keep the subject from ever cooperating with you intentionally and complacently to give you the desired results." This didn't mean subjects didn't pick up on the implicit communication and respond to this by role-taking. It just meant that consciously, if they were role-taking, they didn't realise it. During Clark Hull's experiments in the 1920s and 30s, he explored the question of the impact of hypnotic induction on suggestibility and found that the increase in suggestibility was negligible, but there was up to a 2 times increase in responsiveness. This has continued to be found in research. The question became, if this thing called hypnosis that you do to someone doesn't reliably increase suggestibility, then it can't be an induced state, because if hypnosis was a state of hypersuggestibility, as had often been proposed, and some people respond to suggestions within hypnosis while others didn't, then maybe it isn't a state, but instead role-taking. Perhaps people are taking on the role of hypnotized subject as best they know how, and then carrying out what they feel is expected of them within this role. Erickson noted, based on about 300 subjects and thousands of hypnotic inductions on those subjects, that, far from making them hypersuggestible, it was found necessary to deal very gingerly with them to keep from losing their cooperation. Research on post-hypnotic amnesia by Theodore Barber found that people were more likely to have amnesia when they acted as if they had amnesia. This didn't matter whether they were hypnotized or not. The results were the same, which gives weight to the role-taking theories of hypnosis. When permissive suggestions to try your best to forget were given, hypnotized subjects responded significantly less than non-hypnotized subjects, with 6% of hypnotized subjects forgetting at least 3 of 6 words, and 50% of non-hypnotized subjects. Saying try implies that there will be difficulty, so the hypnotized subjects, who may well be more responsive to nuanced communication, likely responded to the suggestion that they'll have difficulty forgetting. When direct suggestions to forget were given, about a quarter of the hypnotized and non-hypnotized subjects forgot at least 3 of 6 words. And when the simulators who acted as if they had amnesia, almost all of the hypnotized and non-hypnotized subjects forgot at least 3 of 6 words. During research, hypnotized subjects respond differently to simulators, those acting as if they're hypnotized. If people are role-taking, it wasn't thought that this was something they were consciously deciding to do, but instead a role they were taking on implicitly from the context. The overt instructions of the hypnotist and the hypnotist's non-verbal communication. Just like when you're in the presence of a parent, you take on the role of son or daughter. When you're in the presence of a teacher, you take on the role of student. When you're in the presence of a doctor, you take on the role of patient. You don't consciously decide to take on these roles, or any other role in life. You take on these roles naturally, and throughout life, most people learn to take on different roles for different situations. They don't enter the situation thinking about getting into character. It happens automatically. So it may be with hypnosis, that those who expected that they're supposed to be more suggestible during hypnosis responded quicker to suggestions within hypnosis. Those who didn't know either way didn't increase or decrease their suggestibility. And those who thought only weak-willed people could be hypnotized, or had some negative thoughts towards hypnosis, perhaps became less suggestible and took longer to respond to suggestions. The two main domains of hypnosis theories focused on dissociation theories and socio-cognitive theories. The dissociation theories began in the 1800s with Pierre Janet. The most popular dissociation theory is Ernest Hilgard's neo-dissociation theory. Ernest Hilgard and his wife Josephine contributed a significant amount to the field of hypnotherapy. Ernest Hilgard went back to Janet's work, focusing on the idea of conscious versus unconscious processes in dissociation. Hilgard introduced the idea of a hidden observer, the idea that there is a duality where a hypnotized subject can, when experiencing a painful stimuli, for example, and being told they feel no pain, report not experiencing any pain, whilst also reporting, through automatic writing, for example, that they are experiencing pain. They just don't happen to be consciously aware of that pain. There is no doubt that dissociation is a common experience during hypnosis. A subject can experience the automaticity of an arm levitating seemingly by itself, rather than because they're deciding to raise their arm. Other dissociation theories have been proposed, including the dissociated experience theory, which proposes that responses are voluntary. The subject decides to carry out the suggestions, but in hypnosis, volition isn't monitored correctly, and so the subject has the illusion of involuntariness, which can lead to them interpreting voluntary internally generated actions as involuntary externally influenced actions. Dissociated control theory proposes that hypnosis alters how experiences are controlled, so the subject carries out suggestions involuntarily because hypnosis leads to the control system responding to suggestions, bypassing executive functioning. In 1950, Theodore Sabin proposed the idea of a role theory of hypnosis, that hypnosis was a form of social psychological behavior, focusing on the idea that being a hypnotic subject is a role, just like that of psychotherapist, teacher, parent, or any other social role. And as with any other social role, people automatically take on the role as they perceive it. Theodore Barber built on these ideas with his operational approach to hypnosis, which looked at the idea that you could get the same effect if you encouraged active engagement in the process of what was being done, whether you defined it as hypnosis or not. He carried out numerous experiments where he would tell participants that they're taking part in a study to test their imagination, and that they were to cooperate and engage in actively imagining the suggested effects. The results were comparable with hypnosis results. Nicholas Spanos built on Sabin and Barber's work with his multifactorial model of hypnosis. He expanded their work to focus on the importance of the role of attitudes, beliefs, imaginings, attributions, and expectancies. Spanos used the idea of strategic role enactment to explain the difference between a subject that may be faking from a subject that is actively engaging with the role of hypnotized subject, and thus automatically using various cognitive and behavioral strategies to create the desired effect for the role. Another key researcher, Irving Kirsch, developed his response expectancy theory of hypnosis in the 1980s. This theory proposes expectancies for change in subjective experience can affect experience directly and generate convolutional responses. These response expectancies are expectations of automatic responses to certain situations or cues that can lead to self-fulfilling prophecies of those responses then happening. An example of this is the placebo effect, where you expect a large red pill to relieve your headache. You take that pill and your headache passes. The pill may well have just been a placebo, but you had the expectation of how you're supposed to respond to taking the pill, and that expectation leads to automatically carrying out the required cognitive, behavioral, and physiological changes for being pain-free. With Stephen J. Lin Kirsch built on his response expectancy theory and Lin's own theories to create a response set theory. The idea being that most human activity is automatic, and so once an idea or suggestion is formed, it no longer requires much conscious control. The theory is based on work around non-conscious behaviours and automatic responses and cognitions. From moment to moment, humans are responding to response sets, patterned or scripted ways of responding to given situations. So, you see your mother, you automatically become the son or daughter. You see your boss, you automatically become the employee. You take a pill, you automatically respond with the internal script for how that pill should work. Technology has moved on significantly over the years, now bringing us up to date on the history of hypnosis. Researchers are using that technology to better understand what is going on in the brains of hypnotized subjects. When researchers have done relaxation hypnotic inductions on subjects, they see on brain monitoring devices, heart rate monitors and galvanic skin monitors that the subject is relaxed, but not a unique pattern for hypnosis. If they are hypnotized with an active induction, the active state is revealed on monitoring devices, but still no sign of hypnosis. People used to say things like hypnosis was the alpha state, where you're triggering alpha brainwaves. There is no pattern of brainwave detectable with EEG devices that signals that someone is hypnotized. No single brainwave signals hypnosis. Over recent years, researchers like David Spiegel have carried out studies with highly hypnotizable subjects compared to those who score very low for hypnotizability, that have been examined with modern brain scanning devices like structural and functional magnetic resonance imaging scanners. What activity is going on in the brain when the person is hypnotized? What the research suggests is that hypnosis is associated with decreased activity in the brain's default mode network and is associated with greater functional connectivity between the executive control network and the salience network. This pattern of brain activity isn't seen in non-hypnotized subjects or in subjects who didn't respond to the hypnotic induction that was used. The latest thinking on why some people seem to be more hypnotizable than others is around the functional communication between an individual's salient and executive control networks, or the attentional network. The greater the connectivity, the more hypnotizable the individual. The executive network is involved in decision-making, planning, paying attention and working memory. The salience network is involved in selecting what internal and external stimuli we should be attending to at any given moment. The greater connectivity isn't about having a differently structured brain, but about having better coordination between brain areas to do with attention, emotion, action, and intention. Which means those who are most hypnotizable aren't weak-willed and easily controlled. They're those who have greatest control over their own focus and attention and have a natural tendency to become absorbed in experiences. In the next episode, we'll be taking a look at the dark side of hypnosis. We will explore the role of hypnotic techniques used by cults, advertising and seduction, as well as exploring mass hypnosis and mind control.